So, how about a paper that probably won't exist on the internet for too much longer? Just kidding. Not kidding. This is called Keeping Your Mouth Shut: Spiraling Self-Censorship in the United States. It is by Gibson and Sutherland, and it was published in Political Science Quarterly, 2023. Now, this is a paper in which they, now, adorably, we're not talking about government required facades of conformity or opinion suppression, but peer related environments of silence in a polarized political climate for which they could not understand the cause. Oh, how those problems seem so small now. But quickly, before we hit this new paper, remember as we learned last time in We Have Emotions But Can't Show Them! Exclamation point, authoritarian leadership, emotion suppression climate, and team performance, that they said, defining authoritarian leadership as an ambient, demanding, and controlling leadership style. Results indicate that authoritarian leaders are more likely to create a team climate of emotion suppression, which induces a higher level of team emotional exhaustion that negatively impacts team performance. And they found that the more emotion suppression the leader exercised, the stronger the team also suppress themselves to the detriment of their performance, leading us to say suppression from the top down increases suppression for all, especially under ambient, demanding, and controlling authoritarian leadership, and probably, especially, in team environments. So, considering how the kooks have crumbled, we can expect that the findings from our paper today may have become more severe than what these authors originally had determined a few years ago, and likely have some different causations and implications than what our national environment suggested back then. So, the caveat, the world in 2025 is not what it was in 2020 when they conducted the survey, or in 2023 when this paper was published, aside. Let's get into it and figure out how things have gone downhill so quickly in a socio-psycho-political conversation that points towards what we can all expect to continue happening: increased political and personal suppression of opinion and emotion. Now, for most of this episode, I'm going to say very little and just let them do the reporting of their research. But after nearly every line, please know that my brain is chortling. How cute. If only these fuckers had any idea what was coming. Anyways, back then, they said, over the period from the heyday of McCarthyism to the present, the percentage of the American people not feeling free to express their views has tripled. In 2020, more than 4 in 10 people engaged in self-censorship. There can be little doubt that Americans today are deeply divided on their ideological and partisan attachments, many issue preferences, and even their values. Indeed, these divisions can go so far as to extend to the question of whom or what kind of person their children should marry. A concomitant of these divisions is that the political discourse has become coarse, abrasive, divisive, and intense. When it comes to politics today, it is increasingly likely that even an innocent but misspoken opinion will create a kerfuffle to break out. It should not be unexpected, therefore, to find that a large segment of the American people engages in self-censorship when it comes to expressing its views. We define self-censorship as intentionally and voluntarily withholding information from others in the absence of formal obstacles. In an influential study, Michael McCuen refers to this more simply as deciding to talk or clam. In a nationally representative study we conducted in 2020, we asked a question about self-censorship that Samuel Stauffer first put to the American people in 1954. What about you personally? Do you or don't you feel as free to speak your mind as you used to? The 2020 results are sobering. Fully 46% of the American people today reported being less free to speak their minds than they used to. In comparison, a widely noticed contemporaneous 2020 poll by the Cato Institute produced a considerably higher estimate of levels of self-censorship, using responses to the statement, "The political climate these days prevents me from saying things I believe because others might find them offensive." The author concludes, nearly 2/3, 62%, of Americans say that the political climate these days prevents them from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. The share of Americans who self-censor has risen several points since 2017, when 58% of Americans agreed with this statement. What may be even more unnerving, however, is the steady change in levels of self-censorship over the past 70 years or so. At the height of the 1950s Red Scare, when a circumstantial miscue could land a person in jail, Schaffer discovered that only 13.4% of American people felt less free to speak their minds than they used to. Fully 84.7% said they did feel free to speak their minds. During an era in which many perhaps should have been fearful of speaking their minds, in fact, very few Americans seem to have personally felt the heavy hand of the Republican senator from Wisconsin and his many allies and followers. Using a collection of surveys in which the Stouffer question was asked, these data reveal an overall steady erosion of levels of perceived freedom, although there seems to be 2 points of significant decline, 2005 to 2007 and 2011 to 2013. Perceptions of the unavailability of individual level perceived freedom increased rather dramatically from 1954 to 2020. While some might understand these data to indicate that those with, quote, bad views are no longer free to express themselves, which may be a good thing, we have no means of discerning whether the speech lost is good or bad speech. What accounts for this remarkable loss of perceived freedom in the United States? How is it that 4 in 10 of the American people do not feel free to express themselves today? Is this loss of free speech a function of fear of being misunderstood by friends and colleagues, or are the causes more systemic, such as government surveillance of social media, telephone, and email discussions? Our purpose in this article is to explore several hypotheses about the correlates of self-censorship at the aggregate and individual levels. Our analysis here is assuredly not comprehensive or definitive, but in light of the presumed importance of unbridled political discourse for the health of democracies, our findings raise many troubling issues for American democracy. First theory, effective polarization. Carlson and Settle conjecture that change in levels of self-censorship may be related to increasing levels of polarization. Because people so dislike each other and detest each other's views and values, they may perceive a great cost associated with sharing their opinions publicly for little or no reward. Therefore, they keep their mouths shut and refrain from expressing their true opinions. Perhaps a saving grace is that people tend to live in politically homogeneous silos or echo chambers, and therefore are most likely to encounter mainly like-minded folks. Nevertheless, unless one can completely isolate oneself from the toxic political environment of contemporary America, it could be prudent to withhold one's views, at least in certain contexts. Free speech has never been free, but the cost of such speech today seems to have skyrocketed, and to some, the cost may have become exorbitant and out of reach. As polarization has increased, so too has self-censorship. It seems unlikely to us that levels of self-censorship has caused levels of polarization, because we cannot see how silence, keeping one's mouth shut, would contribute to increases in political differences and animosity. Those who are more polarized do not withhold their views more. There may be several reasons for the lack of relationship, but the best explanations most likely have to do with how friends and associates of people react to polarization, rather than the degree of one's own polarization itself. That the relationship is significant also suggests that some who hold polarized views might seek out like minded friends and therefore feel free to express themselves, but that others holding such views do not and therefore do not feel free. Once more, we find no relationship between the degree of partisan polarization in the county and levels of individual self-censorship. Whatever causes people to withhold their views, no doubt takes place at a much more intimate level than that of the county. Next hypothesis: support for civil liberties. Polarization is sometimes narratively associated with unwillingness to recognize the civil liberties of all, especially one's despicable opponents. Therefore, a reasonable hypothesis to account for the dramatic increase in self-censorship in the United States is that people feel less free because reluctance to grant civil liberties to everyone has increased in the country. It turns out that does not seem to be so. From this analysis, it seems entirely clear that a community's political intolerance is not a factor driving people to engage in self-censorship, most likely because, for most, the metropolitan area is much too large definition of the environment of the individual. Next hypothesis: perceived political repression. It appears that the intolerance of ordinary citizens as a whole is not an important factor influencing self-censorship. Perhaps instead it is perceptions that the government would attempt to prohibit certain types of speech. In essence, this hypothesis posits that one source of self-censorship is fear of governmental efforts to quash unpopular speech. Following Gibson, we asked the respondents whether they thought the government would allow them to engage in certain types of political activity. In 2020, approximately 68% of the American people said they felt the government would prohibit none of these activities. About 13% said the government would prohibit all these forms of political action. Those relatively few asserting that the government would allow none of the activities engaged in significantly more self-censorship. We need not make any inference here about the direction of the causal flow. We only conclude that people who self-censor more tend, to some degree, to view their governments as unwilling to allow various forms of political expression. For the first time here, let me interject with a note. Now, where in the world would those perceptions and suppressive behaviors come from? Points to the last 2 weeks of being alive. Summary and discussion. We readily accept and perhaps even embrace the charge that this article raises as many questions as it resolves. Frankly, we did not expect to find that self-censorship is as widespread as it is in the United States, and we were even more nonplussed to discover how it has increased over time. That macro-affective polarization is perhaps part of the explanation of our data seems quite reasonable, but our failure to draw a connection between unwillingness to recognize civil liberties for all and self-censorship is, while not unprecedented in the literature, a fecund and not entirely expected finding. With the exception of the all-pervasive and much-discussed climate of political polarization, one's macro-political environment seems not to be the main source of pressures to censor one's views. It is also noteworthy, and perhaps unexpected, that those who engage in self-censorship are not those with the most limited political resources. Self-censorship is no more common among the poorly educated and less knowledgeable than it is among the better educated and more informed. Ain't that the truth? This analysis has not been very successful in discovering which deviant political views are most subject to social disapproval. We note that Carlson and Settle found that the topic under consideration actually has very little effect on tendencies toward self-censorship. In our data, those who describe themselves as born again do not engage in more self-censorship, nor do strong partisans. It seems likely that what constitutes unacceptable political views is highly idiosyncratic to specific contexts. For example, in certain circumstances, those who favor abortion keep their mouths shut. In other contexts, those who oppose abortion keep their mouths shut. Context-dependent patterns are generally difficult to discern and analyze with survey data such as these. These findings have important potential consequences for the health of democracy in the U.S. As Diana Mutz has written, exposure to dissimilar views has been deemed a central element of the kind of political dialogue that is needed to maintain a democratic citizenry. But if those holding dissimilar views keep their mouths shut, then the unbridled discourse about which Mutz writes may become a thing of the past. So, with that, we learned today that self-suppression or censorship was not related to macro political environments a few years ago, nor was it reflective of desires to take away liberties from disliked groups or to protect those for everyone, nor was it correlated with real government oppression, though it did have correlates with perceived or feared government punishment. We also just learned that having a very strong belief does not mean that that belief will be spoken in all contexts, and fear of being misunderstood by those that we're close to seemingly creates more censorship than fear of government surveillance. Again, that was a few years ago, before there really were means for the government to monitor social media, telephone, and email discussions. More things that have greatly changed since this study was conducted. But all of that said, what the fuck is going on with self-censorship increasing so massively in 2 to 5 years, or the last 2 to 5 months? I think most of us would agree that macro environments have become influences for expression or suppression because the macro have become micro. Conversations about serious topics like civil liberties have become reasons for shutting up and keeping one's head down, or speaking up and shouting from the rooftops at the expense of everyone else. And we can all probably agree that government punishment for speaking freely has become a reality. Free speech is no longer a thing, reported merely 3 days ago. Since this paper was written, we've seen macro environments become personal. Political beliefs aren't something that we support or dissent from in an ambient, nebulous way anymore. They're now in our faces 24/7. Political leanings have become parts of personal identities. Don't tread on anyone's self-concept, or you're trouncing on their liberties, but only their liberties might matter, depending on who you're speaking to. It was more difficult to proudly state unpopular beliefs, such as stripping individuals of their rights in 2020. There wasn't a great deal of support for abusive group rhetoric in public spaces at that time. We were, pretty openly anti-Nazi and pro-women being able to control their bodies. This has all changed, with the internet providing support to every opinion that exists and bringing it right into the palms of every individual in contemporary society, allowing folks to create their own opinion-aligned environments digitally, even if their closest friends and family members dissent. Lastly, at that point in 2020 and 2023, no, there wasn't real government censorship. There was fear of it. There was outrage over political correctness. But any real punishments came from the hands of consumers and people in immediate surroundings. Today, we have bountiful evidence that all of this has changed, that there now are institutionalized punishments being handed down for free speech. So, while this paper was damning and the authors were concerned several years ago, we've now seen the spiral of silence tighten because of, obviously, the internet, giving those who've always been able to shout the loudest infinite platforms to do so, where they can leverage their more bountiful free time to keep screaming. This has resulted in top-down suppressive influences that have wrecked us as individuals and as teams. It's also taught our children to do the same thing and fostered family environments of mandated conformity, negativity, and social coldness, as we learned about last time. I think we can all say that there used to be such a thing as some degree of healthy shame, being concerned about what the people around you thought. Now, those who never learned the meaning of the word shame have less reason than ever to suppress themselves, while insisting on the suppression of everyone else because they have been empowered by similarly minded individuals, perhaps far outside their immediate local environment, thanks to the internet. And also thanks to government encouragement to do so. This incitement of taking up opinions and shutting down others, insisting that free speech can now instead be categorized as unwelcome hate speech, is evidence of how far things have shifted, even since 5 or 2 years ago. And to wrap up for today, as far as where things are headed, they say, in Elizabeth Noel Newman's terms, self-censorship is the driving mechanism in the spiral of silence. In a nutshell, the theory hypothesizes that opinion climate perceptions are related to the willingness to speak out. That is, the fear of being socially isolated owing to holding minority viewpoints encourages people to keep their mouths shut. Without reinforcement, more people remain quiet, with the consequence that orthodox views are established and ascend into a perhaps undeserved domination. The spiral of silence theory is not a theory of government repression. It didn't used to be. Rather, it is a social theory. It is not the officials who are the source of disapproval. Rather, it is one's friends, family, and neighbors, my words, who have been radicalized by the officials who are the source of disapproval and have taken it on as their own personal platform to carry out the plans of others, even against their own ultimate best interest. In terms of the spiral of silence, this means that disagreement with friends and family may lead to a higher state of fear of social isolation as compared with strangers. That fear, we hypothesize, is what drives self-censorship. Finding ways to lower the costs of expressing dissenting views should be a priority for those who favor the liberal democratic form of government. After all, dissent is the essence of democracy. As Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote, mere unorthodoxy or dissent from the prevailing mores is not to be condemned. The absence of such voices would be a symptom of grave illness to our society. With all of that, cheers, y'all. Thanks for taking this dive into psychological and political philosophy as we examine some data from only a few years ago that now feels so fucking cute. I'll talk to you soon. Keep speaking your mind, and we cannot allow those at the top to influence those around us to keep our mouths closed.